podcasting like crazy. You know what I mean? Uh, our episodes with Devi came out. Ooh, Dan's here! Yay! I love the way everything just tumbles in.
It's like I sound like the doorbell's ringing. It's quite lovely. It's like,
It
oh,
is.
hello, come on, welcome in.
What's up, fellas?
There it is.
What's up, Dan?
Yeah, good to hear. Are you guys okay with me being a disembodied voice today?
Sure.
Cool,
Let's
yeah.
do it.
I got Moderna number 2 yesterday, and it's doing a number on me, so I'd rather keep the lights off and just relax and chat with you all about fun stuff when in low light conditions. So,
Right. So, what are some of the effects you're having from it?
I had really nasty chills and what are called rigors, which is basically like shaking. I didn't have
Mm,
a fever, but it's like it was rough all night, and I'm like not feeling so great. So, but totally worth it. To not spread COVID to other people. So
right. And it's only expected to last 36 to 48 hours. So, that's
yeah,
nice.
I'm already starting to feel better. I just want to like take it nice and easy today. But I was like, yeah, I can't pass up the chance to talk to these fellows again. It's been too long.
Yeah, Moderna number 2 did a number on both Debbie and I. Debbie only had some issues for about 18 hours, but like so Debbie has Ehlers-Danlos, and all of their joints were just like on
Mm,
fire. So it was like their
Ooh.
normal joint pain, but like amped up to 11. It was pretty brutal on them for a while.
Yeah,
oh,
that's something I noticed when I was doing case investigations on folks who got COVID itself. Like a lot of them had joint pain, which I think was interesting. And I don't
yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know what the link to that is. I know that it's probably been analyzed by folks with more experience in like medical stuff than I am, but I'm just curious to see what the link is there, why that might be the
Yeah.
case. I don't
We were
have an answer myself. I don't want to speculate.
we were
Right,
talking about an earlier show because we can speculate a little bit.
right,
and
right.
and we were saying that it could be that it just attacks the weaker points of your body, because other people are having other symptoms in other fashions. And I got really dizzy on my second. I got Pfizer and I got really dizzy. I couldn't stand. I was lethargic and my arm hurt a little bit, but that was nothing compared to actually getting COVID and being on a ventilator.
Yeah.
When I was sick, so I got sick in September through December of 2019, and they said that I had either bronchitis or pneumonia, but they couldn't confirm either.
Mm,
And they put me on, the regimen was the same for both. It was basically just, antibiotics and take my inhaler and, wait it out. But I had the issues for months and it was absolutely miserable. And then as we learned more about COVID, I started speculating that I probably had COVID before we knew what COVID was. And after I got shot number 2, I had problems breathing again, the exact same way
mm.
that I felt during September through December of 2019. And so I was like, I think I probably had COVID before we really understood what COVID was.
Yeah.
And just because it was exactly the same. And then based off of what the WHO was saying, they said that there were about a dozen variants running around China by December of 2019. So it wouldn't surprise me that, when we finally get 2019's data, that we start to see a rise in like pneumonia or bronchitis cases that's kind of
Right.
start rising towards the end of the year. And then I think that whatever happened, we get the variant known as COVID that we're now all used to that ends up killing over 500,000 Americans.
Mm,
Yeah, it's really hard to tell. I know that the if you look at the CDC data on mortality from like comparing bronchitis or not bronchitis but like pneumonia and respiratory infection or respiratory disease deaths, there was a spike in deaths that started kind of before COVID was really identified to be like really seriously circulating. Like it was when we knew that COVID was still in in the United States. But those death numbers started to climb into places before we really had a lot of mass testing going on. So I think we were just like a couple weeks too late. But that's the thing with exponential growth. It's like you miss something by a couple days, and you're behind forever afterwards. So
yeah.
Yeah.
it's a real
Right.
challenge. So, but yeah,
Mm. I was looking at the vaccination rates by race. That was the first thing I stumbled on. I didn't put it in my notes or anything, but there's a vast disparity between white and Asian and black populations. And I just wondered if you could dispel any myths that this COVID treats people of different races in different ways? Because I can't see why people would be hesitant to get it based on their race. I don't understand that one.
So it's not. So actually, that's a really interesting question. Because I don't think it's a question of whether or not COVID is COVID is definitely disproportionately affected certain people of color. But a lot of that is based on the link between race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status in the United States.
Exactly.
So
Right.
a lot of people who are Black or Hispanic or Latinx, because of systemic racial issues, live in areas of the country that are lower income, have less access to reliable healthcare, but
Hmm.
also a lot of those people of color those communities have had culturally or historically bad relationships with public health professionals. So part of it is
Right.
not public health is not just kind of forgotten about them. Like there's obviously all kinds of stories about the vaccines being shipped to places where it's kind of easier to go to,
Hmm.
where you have more established infrastructure, and that happens to be in more well-off communities, which happen to be more white because of, again, systemic racism. But also, if you go back to the history of public health, there have been a lot of things we've done, even in the up into the mid 20th century and beyond, that were objectively racist. Like I don't know if you've heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study, where
Yep.
black men were deliberately given syphilis to study them. And so
Right.
that's just a major kind of flash in the pan story. But there's been a lot of situations where people of color in disadvantaged communities have not been well served by public health infrastructure, and that is our failure. So it's not an issue of Black people are less likely to get severe COVID. In fact, mortality rates for Black people and Latinx people are higher.
Right.
But it's not necessarily because of race. It's because of systemic factors that are linked to race that are
Right.
causing public health issues. And that's it's the same thing. It's one thing that I've talked about a lot with my colleagues is that COVID has really brought out or really forced us to acknowledge a lot of the problems that we've had in our society, both racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, but also the 40-hour work week, right? It's
Right.
up and down everything in our society. We've kind of been forced to question because of the lockdowns, because of the sudden changes to what we consider to be normal, and
Yeah.
that's really been the racial issues in this country have been magnified and really brought into the front and center because of COVID and the responses that we've had to have for COVID.
Yeah, we don't realize how much of our communities are on the edge of poverty until something just tips them over.
You know,
Absolutely.
even with where I work, on a lot of the changes that we've had to make with work from home, we've noticed that, there have been we've exchanged some stresses for others. So like for example, we are far lower on the concerns of child care, child health, like how we're
Mm.
going, people being able to make it into work, some of those questions, because with work from home, everybody has their setup and, they've y- their internet connection, that's another issue that we've had to solve. But they've been able to more reliably care for their family, especially younger children. And now with the look at return to work happening, we're starting to see some of that nervousness around returning to work due to, number one, lack of vaccinations in younger,
Right.
the younger population. Number two, just that whole return of, well, now I have to choose, transportation and childcare and all of that. And but the stress that we've had during work from home is everybody's felt burnt out, because you just, even though we are when you're done, you're done, you're not getting back on your work computer. That's just,
Hmm.
those are our rules. I mean, if somebody needs to reach you, they can reach you tomorrow when you sign in, or on Monday, or whatever. So I mean, we've definitely seen that exchange, and I think that's something that, at least in, for my organization, we're going to have to keep that in mind as we move forward. But number two, I mean, every organization out there is going to have to think about that. Not everybody's going to be comfortable sending their kid back to school without vaccinations, even though, yeah, the rates of children getting COVID is low. We've actually started to see a rise in that, even here in Thurston County now, where we've had several outbreaks in Olympia schools. And that's just one of those things where, I mean, it doesn't take a math person or or an immunologist or an epidemiologist to be able to say that children are a vector of disease.
Right. All
Yeah.
right.
I mean, it is a real challenge to I think it's a very American problem, right? It's not we're very good at intervening very aggressively, and we have no idea how to pull out safely and securely, right? Now it's like
That's
say
for
look at
sure.
Afghanistan and Iraq, right? We've been in there for so many years, like we're really good at like dumping troops in and having like a conquest focused mind. Like we'll shut down code, we'll stop it from spreading. But now we're like, okay, how do we kind of extricate ourselves? Culture. I think there's a cultural issue that we've got in America of like not being able to like ease off the gas in a sensible way. But I don't know.
Yeah.
That's just my thoughts.
I don't think we can ease off the gas if 58 million people are vaccinations and 74 million people just don't believe they need to get it because the other people will get it. And that brings us to herd immunity. And
Hmm.
there was a time when we were promoting herd immunity. Well, the prior administration was promoting herd immunity for the disease, that everybody should get the disease so it would go away. But it seems like those same people don't believe in herd immunity for the vaccine, that we should all get the vaccine so that we can build up our herd immunity. And I don't know how we get past that.
It'll be it's a perpetual problem, right? It's
Yeah.
there's looking back looking back to the history of public health, right? It's not just herd immunity. There's always a substantial minority of the population that has always been against changes in policy
Yeah.
because of freedoms. Like you look back, one of the most successful vaccination like of smallpox and polio were two of the most successful public health campaigns in the history basically. But
Agree.
one of the other most successful public health campaigns was the implementation of seatbelt laws in cars and changing car designs, especially in the 50s and 60s. Because if you look at the normalized or population adjusted mortality rates for car crashes back then, it was way higher than it was now. And
Right.
then cars got redesigned, airbag laws, changes to ways that even steering wheels were designed,
Mm-hmm.
seatbelts were implemented, laws all about that. There
Hmm.
was a substantial but very vocal minority of folks who really hated that like impingement on people's freedom.
I
But
know.
then what happened was like now not really there's very few people who are like really against seatbelts because
Right.
over decades, it takes generations for people to kind of accept the change of the norm, and it's really worked. Like yes, we have, if you look at the rate, the death numbers, we have more people dying from car crashes today than we did in the 50s and 60s. But that's the same thing with epidemiology. Like you adjust for the increase in population, it is
Right.
way decreased, right? One of my favorite sayings is epidemiology is the study of denominators, right? You're
Hmm.
always you're calculating rates and trying to count, and okay, these many people are dying from this, and these many people have diseases, but you have to make sure that you're adjusting for the population changes, or defining the groups that you're trying to study really well. And that's a classic example. But back to your point was that yeah, there's always going to be people who, whenever there's something that's public health that is objectively helpful to society, are just going to reject it on the basis of freedom and impinging on rights. And it's a fair question to bring up. At what point does public health get superseded by individual liberty? And it's a
Mhm.
constant debate in the field.
Yeah, and that was started in 1902, actually, 1905, the first Supreme Court case. But, I relate it to something even older, jaywalking. People used to cross the street anywhere and they would just get hit and die. But then they started a campaign where they would mock people for jaywalking and actually tease them and make the public want to make fun of them until they just didn't want to do it because it was too embarrassing to do. And I think that's where we have to go with getting more people to get vaccines, is to guilt them and embarrass them into getting them.
And that's one of the funny things is because I was having a conversation about vaccination rates in the Army, and one of the biggest pushbacks that that they've heard is that, well, the vaccine's not FDA approved, so I don't want to get it. And my friend said, look, at this point, do you really think it's not going to get FDA approved? Either Pfizer or Moderna? And that's the reality is that like the FDA approval thing has been a really funny point to me because we got emergency use authorization, which in and of
Mhm.
itself is a form of FDA approval. It's not full approval,
Right.
clearly, but obviously it's been judged to be safe enough that it could be released to the public. When I look at what we've seen from Pfizer and Moderna, the risks are relatively low. With Johnson and Johnson, it's a lot higher. Like when I look at the way that our system works, and how we just pulled the plug on AstraZeneca. That's not going to be an option in this country from the looks of it. That's honestly the way that I expect our system to work. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it seems as though there's a lot more there are more questions about what might be the root cause of some of these blood clots, especially because the early data showed that it was only in women like 18 to 35 or 40, and that's like prime birth control usage. And birth control, like one of the notorious problems with birth control is blood clotting. So the question there is, were these women on birth control, and that the blood clotting issues were a function of the birth control, versus were these women on birth control and the vaccine kind of, gave that clotting issue an additional push.
I don't see how the two could be correlated that way, though. But I don't know anything
It's
about
it's
coronavirus.
so hard to like establish those kinds of correlations or
Right,
causality because there were 6 cases. There were
right.
6 cases. Whenever you're trying to do any kind of population level study, it's incredibly difficult. And I actually had the privilege of being on one of the calls where the CDC updated a bunch of health officials, like explaining in detail all the data that went into why they had that pause in Johnson & Johnson because of the blood clots. And when you adjust, as I mentioned, epidemiology is the science of denominators. When you look at the group that was affected, which was the women of females of reproductive age who had the vaccine, the risk, the elevated risk of that specific population getting the vaccine versus not for the particular condition was between 4 and 16 times more likely to have something happen, have that condition occur if you had taken the vaccine recently. So 4 to 16 times is sounds really dangerous, but then again, you have to be like 4 to 16 times versus 6 cases, right? Because it's an exceptionally
Right.
rare condition. And
Right.
and to Jeffrey's point, like rates of blood clotting from birth control and rates of other side effects from other medications that people just accept as normal, right? They're much riskier. And the classic David Offit is a really prominent vaccine outreach guy. He said, and it's been very accurate, the riskiest part, at least for the Pfizer Moderna, the riskiest thing that you do related to your vaccine is actually driving to go get the vaccine, because you're more
Right.
likely to get killed in a car crash than you are dying from getting, after getting the Pfizer Moderna. So it comes down to a public assessment of risk and how we interpret it and whether or not we can do it. And historically, humans have been terrible at assessing and understanding relative risk, which is a
Yeah.
miracle we're still alive as a species.
Well, I mean, that's one of those things, like, we, in my family, unfortunately, my Uncle Tom had a stroke 7 days after he got the Moderna vaccine. And some of my family has decided that because my Uncle Tom got the vaccine and had a stroke, that's clearly the cause. Now, I love my Uncle Tom dearly, but, as a scientist, I have to be objective about what might have caused that. And the reality is that my Uncle Tom has not exactly lived his best life in terms of health. Like, constant smoker, he drank a lot and hard. He has had, he was known as the bread king in eastern Montana. Health wise, like, the guy has literally done everything to his health that doctors would be like crying in the corner over. But suddenly, he got his first shot, nothing happened. He got the second shot, and then 7 days later had a stroke. Now, of course, the CDC is going in and they're doing a full investigation as to what might have happened.
That's
And
awesome.
that's where I tell people, it's like, look, correlation does not equal causation. He had no problems during the first shot. He got the second shot. 7 days later is when he had a stroke. There are a lot of questions that are going to be laying out there. Like, was this already underlying? Like, I couldn't tell you because I don't have access to his health records. Like, did he have high blood pressure? Did they notice hardening of the arteries early on? Like, there's so much information out there that we don't have. But
Sure.
everybody, just depending on your mindset, you're looking for an excuse to either do something or not do something. And unfortunately, in this case, they're using it as an excuse to not do something. And I think that that's a mistake. Now, if the CDC says, yes, absolutely, this was definitely a cause of that, then it's something that we're going to have to accept. But also, if they come back and say, look, The lifestyle your uncle lived was, by any doctor's standards, I mean, that's kind of one of those things that we're going to have that question pop up of, did the vaccine cause this or did the lifestyle cause this? And I think that's probably a really good question in a lot of cases where you might find adverse effects that they just aren't related, but there's enough underlying health issues and health conditions there that they were already potentially in a bad spot before the vaccine happened, and maybe the vaccine knocked something loose, kind of like what we were talking about with Johnson. There's just, in terms of the data that's available, there's just no way to say that, at least there's no easy way to say it. I'm sure that their methodology is far more in depth, and maybe Dan knows a little bit more about that.
I don't know how you could know anything in 18 months about any of this that you don't expect to know in 10 years.
Yeah, I think Jeffrey brings up, just to kind of abstract from what Jeffrey was saying, is that the whole question about your uncle getting a stroke, and again, I'm very sorry that happened, is that you are approaching that discussion and debate in a good faith, wanting to find out what happened way, and you're trying to set your own biases for or against the vaccine aside, and that is a really serious thing to do. It's a very difficult thing for us to put our emotions aside, especially when it comes to our family member safety. And so when we have these discussions, a lot of people have their own biases, their own emotional approaches, both for and against the vaccine. And I'm personally very for the vaccine because I've looked at the evidence. But I think one thing that a lot of people who are very vaccine hesitant or vaccine skeptical, I don't want to say vaccine hesitant, people who are very firmly anti-vaccine have a fundamental belief that public health officials are trying to force a bad vaccine onto people to deliberately cause harm, death, or control or something like that. And like, I this is anecdotal, but everyone I work with, just if we had any evidence that any vaccine was causing more harm than good, it would be pulled off the market, right? That's just the way that it is. But people have this, this pre-biased or this preset bias in their head where it's like, well, because they're putting this injection into my arm, they want me to do it because they're the government, and I don't trust the government, and everything kind of steamrolls from there. And it's very hard to engage in discussions with folks like that because whatever you try to talk through, you're not going to break through their bias. Whereas people who are vaccine hesitant, like there's a lot of women who are concerned about fertility because there was, again, a lot of that has been debunked, but people are very concerned about fertility. Like you can have a good faith discussion because they want to know, or folks who are concerned about long-term effects of the vaccine who are like, I'm going to wait and see. Those are people you can engage and have a discussion in, and that's where we're really going to improve vaccine uptake, not with the folks who are going to be firmly against it, no matter how hard it is, but the folks who are concerned and worried and would be happy to have a discussion and want to look at the data and want to do that. And there's tens of millions of Americans in that situation, and that's where we really should be focusing our efforts to improve rates of vaccine uptake. And I just really hope that public health officials are willing to engage in those discussions more and more.
So I think on that question though, I think we need to maybe dig into it a little bit more personally. I think one of our biggest shortfalls is that, this day and age where you have the media on blast for not necessarily being as honest as you'd like it to be, people are looking more towards, I mean, unfortunately there's social media, but once again, even the social media presence by, like, say, the CDC or your county health officials, people are quick to dismiss that. So I guess the question would be is there more of a role of family doctors to play in this?
Of course.
By working, with those that haven't been vaccinated and sitting down and being able to address those issues. Just because, like, a lot of people tend to listen to their family doctors a lot more closely than, let's say, their uncle or their cousin.
You know who they're listening to is their pastors and their church congregations. And I think that's an important place. That's the place to let them know it's just not okay, that the mocking, in a way that only a church can do, mock their people into doing what they need to do. But I think there's a bit of a slippery slope theory with anti-vaxxers, and they're saying you want to take this right so you can take two more the next time. And I just don't think they're thinking about the overall public good. You know what I mean? So It's all a tough thing, but we all need to get involved, and that's why we're doing this. My actual concern with having Dan on was I didn't think people were listening to scientists anymore. The ones that would already have, and the ones that don't aren't going to believe Dan. He could speak for a half an hour, and in the end, they're just going to say "nuh-uh," and they're right. And so that's what really bugged me. But I did want to get to some specific questions that people are having about it, and then maybe Dan can help explain the finer points of it. So
Absolutely. That's why I joined. I'm always happy to have these discussions, and that's why I want to keep coming back. So,
there,
shoot,
there,
go
there's a
for it.
there's a question about what if I am allergic to specific ingredients in the vaccine? And some people aren't getting tested. They're just saying I might be. And so, and the answer is no. Don't get vaccinated if you are allergic to the specific components of the vaccine. But I wanted to ask Dan because the Pfizer vaccine has three ingredients. Well, four. It has the mRNA, but it has lipids, salts, and sugars. And so, honestly, in the Pfizer, I couldn't pronounce any of the name of the lipids, and I was hoping to just get a general description on what a lipid is.
Absolutely. So a lipid is a type. So carbohydrates, lipids, proteins. Those are some of the major categories of different types of molecules that exist in nature,
Right.
and they're some of the types of molecules that make up all of life. Right. So a lipid is there's different types of lipids, but they are basically types of molecules that are predominantly found in like membranes of your cells, right?
Okay.
So that's a place where a lot of them are found. They're very similar. When you think lipid, think like oils. All of our
Right.
cells are basically sacks of water with stuff in them that are separated by thin layers of oils. And those oils basically are like one of the major components are lipids. So without getting too technical, they're very like oil based. They do not mix well with water, but they are key parts in making up kind of dividing sections of our cells and also dividing sections in viruses, right? So, with the vaccine itself, with like the Pfizer and Moderna, which vaccines are very similar, the lipids is the type of molecule that makes the little package that the mRNA is in. So you have the mRNA in the middle, which is like the genetic material that your cells use to create the surface protein that your immune system responds to. But the lipids are basically the package in which those come in, and that's a kind of a standard way for all, like, you have all kinds of like virus like particle research, and all viruses use kind of lipids as packets as well as all of our cells. So the fact hearing the word lipids does not necessarily mean anything bad. It's just, part of life. It's just a type of molecule. But that's what to think of as like the oily like edges, or the oily the sacs that kind of make up the barriers or boundaries between our cells or viruses or bacteria.
Fantastic. So this is one of my favorite ones that has actually come up and that I've addressed personally, but I definitely want to hear your take on this as well. So one of the questions that has come up that I've seen is, well, what could possibly be in the vaccine to cause it to expire and them not be able to use all the doses during their vaccination efforts? My explanation was that, when they gave emergency use authorization, when what they do is they have to use the vaccine pretty much exactly the way that it was used in the trial. So if it had a specific shelf, if it only had a specific shelf life during the trial, that was their limit for how they could use it. That doesn't necessarily mean that the vaccine expires or expires in that time frame. It just means that according to the way that it was used in the trial, they can't use it outside of that method. So they just don't have the data to find out how effective it is after sitting on the shelves for a while. That's something that they have to figure out yet still, or maybe they have it figured out, but they were only using it, within a certain range of days. So that way it's, for the emergency use authorization, it's you only use it during that specific time frame. Everything else has to get shipped off or shipped back or however they decided to do that.
Yeah, you're I think that's part of it, at least, is that, and that's something to kind of take a step back and say, yes, the way the emergency use authorizations or even FDA approval processes are very strict and very specific for any kind of drug, including any vaccine. Right, you have to use it within this particular amount of time, or you have to dispose of it, or just use these kind of very standardized formulas or protocols to be able to give it to folks. But another major reason why you have to give it so quickly is because the vaccine itself, which looks like a virus, if you look at the molecular level, the way it looks like is basically a fake virus. Those will break down over time at room temperature or at body temperature. So you have to keep them frozen. I think Moderna usually at -20. Pfizer was at -80. I think people are now using -80 degrees Celsius as well. I'll have to double check myself on that. But when you have those really, really cold temperatures, the vaccine components stay stable. But if you thaw those out to be used for vaccine dispensing, then over time, those are going to break down. And if you break down the structure, which is, like I mentioned, like the lipids, which make up the sac that the genetic material mRNA is in,
Right.
if you let that decompose or degrade, then it's not going to do the biology of how it actually works doesn't work, and then it's not going to be effective. You might as well just be injecting some saline into some person is saying that's a vaccine, right? So part of it is definitely like there's a specific protocol that needs to be followed because it worked in the clinical trials that way. But also part of it is you want it to actually be stable and actually have the same structure. So part of it is like regulatory, and part of it is just like knowing the biochemistry of the vaccine itself.
I think of the lipid as like the mat when you go down a slip and slide, it helps it get where it needs to go. It lubricates the pathway for what you're trying to deliver.
That's a way to think about it. Yeah, I think that I like that. I think of it as like you're trying to drive from point A to point B in a car, right? And
Right.
you're in the car. You are the genetic material trying to get from point A to point B to do something. Either go to work or see your family, whatever. You're trying to do something, and you use your car as the way that you drive around. Well, if you leave your car out in the rain and don't take care of it for 15, 20 years, and then it's rusty, and then the car just kind of literally falls apart on the way, you're not going to get from point A to point B. So it's basically the same thing, except at a much more accelerated rate when you let these things just stay out at room temperature for too long. Like you don't want the car breaking down and the axles rusting out and falling out, and you're stuck on the side of the road. You're like, well, shit, I don't know what's going to go next. So sorry.
Right.
Language.
But generally, people aren't allergic to lipids, is I think what I was trying to get at.
Yeah, I'm not a pharmacist, so I don't want to comment too much on it, but the lipids that make up the vaccine are very similar to the lipids that are in a lot of our cells. So some people might have some sensitivity to some of the small ingredients, but the rate of people or the percent of people who really truly have serious allergies to these vaccine ingredients in general is really, really low.
Yeah,
it's important for us to know, and if people are truly allergic, we want to make sure that they know and that they don't get the vaccine. And then those of us who are able to get the vaccine, we should, to help protect those who cannot. Because if we are immune, if a lot of us are immune, talk about herd immunity, a lot of us are immune, that reduces the number of ways that a virus can get through the population to that person who's not vaccinated.
Exactly.
I think it's important, and we should definitely take people who are worried about their allergies very seriously, accommodate them, try to get them the testing to confirm that they are, and then if they are allergic, say, okay, don't get the vaccine because we don't want you to have a serious reaction. That's not our goal right now. We don't want anyone to die from this.
But there is a way to test. There is a way to test instead of just being scared, not knowing, and saying, I'll just wait. You can get tested to see if you're allergic for these ingredients.
Yes.
Which
they are available.
Sugar, salt, and oil. It's not like they're exotic. So
yeah, I mean that's a way to think about it, right? Like with there are definitely some things about the vaccine components that are not I don't want to say not natural, but there are, like when you look down at like the actual like building blocks, you get down to basically the molecular version of the Legos, right? You have some lipids or carbohydrates or sugars or proteins that are made up of like a red block, a blue block, and a green block of Lego. And you might be allergic to red block, blue block, green block, and someone else when you might be 1 in a million and everyone else is fine with it. So really understanding that there are definitely ways to test that,
Hmm.
and people who are concerned or who have had past histories of allergies to these vaccines should be good. Should definitely get the support that they need, and allergy physicians being able to help out. But that's
Right.
another reason why we have like the standard practice of waiting 15 minutes after the vaccine,
Hmm.
right? Because we're not really sure. We haven't had the long-term data to see, but we have all these people who wait 15 minutes. And I actually know somebody who did have an anaphylactic reaction within like 5 minutes of getting the shot. So
Wow.
they were on site. The EMTs were on site. They had the EpiPens, the epinephrine to take care of that. And someone who would have probably died if they were just like on their way home
Hmm.
got treated immediately, went to the hospital, was discharged a few hours later completely fine because we had that system in place, right? And
That's
so
so
again,
beautiful.
going back to the point that Jeffrey and I discussed earlier, right? Having the good faith understanding that we're not trying to inject some random control thing into people's bodies. We want to
Hmm.
stop COVID, and we have set up this structure to be able to make sure that anyone who does have rare reactions gets the immediate urgent support that they need.
Sure. But if your friend and your friend's friend told you that there's something bad in the vaccine, you kind of stress about it without researching it. And then you have that placebo effect kind of thing where you think it's going to happen because someone told you it would.
Oh
And
yeah.
so that's what I'm just trying to get past. I'm letting people know. So the Moderna vaccine is an interesting thing because it has the mRNA, it has lipids, and it has salts, but it has acids like citric acids, and acid stabilizers. Is there a difference there, or is that just the replacement for the sugars?
I mean, it's not it's an additional preservative, right? So citric
Right,
acid. I mean, citric acid is in every. You have one glass of
Oranges.
orange. Yeah, you have a glass of orange juice.
right,
You're getting a million times more citric acid than you are from the vaccine, right? The relative dosage.
right.
Right? Everyone was talking. This is off topic a little bit, but like the all the vaccines, everyone's afraid of a ingredient called thimerosal. It's like
Mm,
because it contained mercury. Well, if
I
you
have
ever
that
eaten
note, yeah.
if you ever eaten a pear, you've had 100 times or 1,000 times more mercury from that one pear than you have from a single vaccine that ever contained any thimerosal. But still, thimerosal was outlawed, and it's not in modern vaccines anymore.
That's
So
right.
it's all about this relative this idea of the dose makes the poison. I mean, some
Hmm.
things are really toxic, and for sure, and we don't want to we don't want to assume that everything is non toxic just because it's a small quantity. But a small amount of citric acid sounds like a scary word, right? It's acid. You think of stuff that like burns your skin. It's like,
Right, right.
well, I mean, I can read off if you look at the molecular components of an apple, I can they sound really scary when you break that down. In fact, if you give me a few seconds, I'm going to pull that up, like the list of
No problem.
molecular components of an apple.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah, just give me about 30 seconds,
I can,
and I'll
I
I
pull
think
it up.
can,
I
Yeah.
think I'm more afraid of citric acid after I have a bowl of Captain Crunch.
right.
There's a lot. Believe me, there's a lot. If you ever had a cigarette, you ever had a hot dog,
Mm.
you do
Oh
not need to
God.
worry about the level of citric acid in a.
Yeah,
And
if you've had a hot dog, you've eaten more sphincter than most people have that claim to eat ass.
I do have a note on that.
Oh joy, that's not something I ever expected to hear. But wow, that's hilarious.
And I do have a note on that about some of the anti-vax rhetoric going on and the mercury being that issue. And so I do have that down. They stopped using that in 1999. They started removing toxins. There's a new movement called green vaccines, and there's research that's ongoing. It's all been disproven. The effects don't the toxins that were in there do not cause what you're saying it causes, but they're still researching it to this day, 22 years later. You know
Yeah.
what I mean?
Let me read. I found a good peer-reviewed
Yeah.
article from the journal Advances in Nutrition, which goes and talks about some of the chemicals that are in an apple, just to give a comparison, right? So let me try and read some. Hydroxycinnamic acid,
See?
dihydrochalcone,
Oh, I don't like that.
flavanol,
Mm.
procyanidin. What else we got? Anthocyanin, polyphenol, epitacacan. Right? All that sounds really scary, but that's an organic apple.
It's
That's a good old nice organic tasty apple that keeps
I
the doctor away, right? So
I mean, it probably has the chemical dihydrogen monoxide in it too, and we
oh
should all
god,
be
that's
very.
100% of people who've had dihydrogen monoxide have died, right?
Mm.
Yep.
It's water. by the way.
That's water. No, it was
Right.
hilarious. We actually did that in high school where the science teacher that I had did this whole campaign to try to get the school to ban dihydrogen monoxide. And I mean to tell you, like it took off. Like people were like freaked out about dihydrogen monoxide. And then when we're sitting there in chemistry class, the teacher asked me to sign it and I said no. And it's like, why? Why would you not ban this chemical? It's killed so many people. Like it causes vomiting and diarrhea. It's a main ingredient in so many of these things. I'm like, I'm not banning water. And then all of a sudden you just see like everybody get really confused. And it's like dihydrogen monoxide is the chemical name of water. And then all of a sudden you just see people go, oh God, I got freaked out over nothing. Oh no. Now, luckily we didn't have the social media side of things back in that at that point. But I mean, that's one of the problems about like chemistry and sciences is that it's so easy to get people freaked out over things that they don't understand and just the simple act of trying to ban dihydrogen monoxide was it caught on very hard because like we know what carbon monoxide is and carbon monoxide happens to be very bad for you.
Yeah. Oh, I fully agree, and it's the same thing. It's something to keep in mind is that you can whip people into a frenzy very quickly,
Yeah.
and it's something that we all get caught up in, right?
Mhm.
It's important for us to keep in mind that it's like we get caught up in our own biases, and that's why it's important for all of, like it's kind of a circle of accountability, right? When we see other people like spouting off bullshit, to respectfully engage them and say, hey, this is not true,
Right.
and here's why. And it's like always like it's when having these discussions, it's always important to have a first instinct that people are not trying to be scammers, right? Most people who are raising concerns about this are not actually trying to like scam people out of something or be deliberately evil or
Yeah.
manipulative or psychopathic about any of it. Like people just it's understandable. Like most of the people who are anti-vaccine or vaccine hesitant have the same kind of philosophy towards general health as we do, and that is, I don't want to die from having a bad medication or a bad chemical in my body, and I don't want my children or my family members to be harmed by something that could really kill them.
Right.
That's pretty much the whole point behind all of public health, right? We want people to not die from preventable diseases and toxic compounds, right?
Yeah,
So
please.
if you really take the extra moment to say, look, I agree with you on that that fundamental level, I just disagree on the like, and have a try and engage in that good faith. Now, obviously, there's people who are snake oil salesmen, and those people need to be called out because they are deliberately misleading folks. But most people
Yeah,
aren't,
they
and
are.
most people are just good people who are concerned about their health and the health of their community, and that's something that we really need to embrace more. I remember in one of my public health classes in grad school, where we were it was a class of 150 people. It was like I went to a graduate school of public health, but I did not do a master's of public health degree. I did a master's science degree, and so all the master's science and doctoral students had to take a class, which was like a crash course in like basics of public health.
Mm.
And in one of those classes, it was talking about like this whole thing, like public understanding and health literacy. And the professor like showed a tweet that has gone kind of viral multiple times, pun intended, where it was like, I don't like vaccines. I just wish that scientists would come up with some way for us to like get some immunity to the virus or a virus without it actually causing disease. But I don't like vaccines. And the 100+ people in the class just laughed at this tweet and like thought, oh, look, get a load of this dumbass. I'm like, why are we laughing? The fact that this guy said that on social media is a failure of our job to be able to engage and educate, right?
Hmm.
We should be reflecting on like, how did we fuck up so that he believes something that is like genuinely not true? Because that's something that we could very clearly say, hey, this is how the vaccine works. Like we need to reflect ourselves and say on ourselves and say, what are we doing wrong that is preventing people from understanding or preventing people from getting access to that information or being in a state of mind where they want to engage, right?
I
And
think
that's a
Yeah.
very hard introspective thing to do.
yeah, I think one of the biggest problems though is that like as scientists it's easy for us to talk about things on a grad school level or even at an undergraduate level, But I think one of our biggest shortcomings is that we don't really try to communicate things on a national understanding level, which is about an 8th grade level. I think that's one of our biggest shortcomings is that it's very easy for me to get involved in, in talking about the technical calculations and how you track and trend data, and then suddenly just have someone sitting there looking at me, eyes completely glossed over, thinking I'm a witch doctor. And the reality is that it's, the math itself is very complicated, but the way that we're actually looking at this information is very simple. And so maybe that's one of the things that in terms of public health that we need to be really looking at is how do we actually communicate this stuff at the appropriate level, so that way we don't have, like you said, this issue of somebody sending out a tweet and it going viral. But the reality is that it's actually pretty fucking harmful.
It is very harmful, and I fully agree with you. And that's something that is only starting, unfortunately, only starting to really gain ground in public health. It's the concept of health literacy, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you this it's a little bit abstract, but basically health literacy is like how well you understand the basics of not just medical care. Like you don't need to like be able to like diagnose and treat disease and know all your prescriptions and everything, but just generally understanding things that are healthy, things that are not, and understanding what are true risks to your health and how things work.
Right.
And if you adjust, like even if you adjust for like age, race, sex, comorbid conditions, health, and all that other stuff, health literacy status is one of the most reliable predictors of overall health over a lot of conditions, or like a lot of medical conditions people have, because somebody who is very severely overweight, or somebody who has diabetes, or somebody who has XYZ condition, who does not understand what that condition means and what they need to be mindful of, is going to have
Mm-hmm.
much worse overall health than somebody who knows what it is and understands and is mindful of it. And so a lot of it's kind of like, to Jeffrey's point, a lot of us like to talk in public health at a very higher level of like detailed understanding that takes years to get to, and we
Right.
forget how to engage with folks. And when we do that, we're actually harming the public a lot more than we're working on all these esoteric papers that are only going to be read for a few hundred people in our field, as opposed to thinking, okay, how can I communicate this to people who are inherently good, inherently want what's best for their health, but just have not had the accessibility of the education that we've had, without being condescending and saying, "Oh, you little dumb little idiots who don't know understand." Like that's not that's. But a lot of people in public health and in science have that unconscious bias towards people who are not in science, and we really need to break
Sure.
through that. So
One of our friends, it was funny because I was, our friend Adam, A-Dog, shout out A-Dog, we love you, buddy. Him and I sat down one day and we were talking about the moon landing and got into the conversation of, how was it possible to make it to the moon and back on a tank of rocket fuel? And so, because I have a broad depth of understanding in a lot of different subjects, I was explaining orbital physics to him. Now, I can't break down the math for Adam. I mean, I can barely break down the math for myself. But understanding that it's like, okay, if you understand how gravity works, gravity is going to pull you down this way. And if you understand how thrust works, thrust is going to push you one way. Well, what you're doing is you're using those forces to create yourself a faster pull. And it's what they call the slingshot effect that rounds you out that'll get you much faster speeds. So that way you can get to the moon using less fuel. And so, that's kind of one of those things. Like, A-Dog is not stupid. It's just that I can explain things on a different level that only about, like you said, a few hundred people are going to understand. But when you break it down to say this is how these two things work very simply in order to get you there, it really does help out in understanding that, okay, this is actually possible. I don't have to know orbital physics in order to understand how this works.
Okay. Well, from orbital physics back to ingredients of vaccines.
and this is why I love the conversations with you guys. Like we
Yeah.
go on really interesting tangents, but all of it is relevant. You can talk about how orbital physics communication is relevant to public health. So I think that's pretty awesome.
Exactly. And there's so many ways I could go with that. I just think that when you send somebody a text, they take it a certain way. And so I think when somebody's using larger language to communicate what they're trying to communicate, it can come off as kind of condescending. But then when we get you here to speak, I think people can hear in your voice the sincerity and not the sarcasm, you know? So I appreciate you being here for that, because I think people hear, they believe the first thing they read, but I think we can overwhelm them with just comprehensive information and conversation that can change their minds. And that's why I love doing this. But there's an ingredient in the Johnson and Johnson vaccine that I want Dan to comment on, because
Mm.
of course there's the acids, the citrics, right? There's the salts, there's the sugars, but there's something called ethanol.
Does anyone know what ethanol is? Going once, going twice.
Hold on. I think I might have some.
Jeffrey,
Yeah.
you have the farm background. Why don't you tell us what ethanol is?
I've never
It's
heard of it.
alcohol.
Yeah. If you never drunk a beer, you drunk a lot more alcohol. I've drunk a lot more ethanol than you have in any vaccine. But yeah, ethanol is a
Right.
great preservative, and that's why, I mean, the whole reason why Western civilization created beer is because ethanol is a great preservative and a great
Mhm.
antibacterial, right? The
Right.
Eastern cultures brewed tea to boil out the bacteria, and we brewed beer to ferment out the bacteria. So, and we use ethanol. So yeah, if people are concerned about ethanol vaccines, I get it, but ethanol is just good old, like, you have a beer, you've had a lot more ethanol than you're ever going to get in a vaccine.
But I put that in my car too. But we put it in everything, by the way.
But you actually like. So on the ethanol thing, though, that's one of those things. The lack of understanding is that if you have too much ethanol, it actually draws water in to your
Mm-hmm.
gas tank, and it'll cause your engine to rust out in a way that you don't want. So, like everything else, like the amount of ethanol that's in this vaccine is very specific, so that way it doesn't dilute or change the efficacy into the negative or kill off whatever it is that we're trying to put into people.
Right. It's the last ingredient, and they usually it goes from largest to smallest. So, um, really quickly, if you have allergies or allergic reactions to general vaccines, you should consult your health provider before you get the vaccine. And anyone with just food allergies, that's what Dan was talking about. If you have allergies to medications or latex or pets or even insects, then that's when you can still get the vaccine, but you're going to be held for about 30 minutes as opposed to the 15, just to add to the precautions of that. But you can still get the vaccine if you have allergies in general, and you can talk to your doctor about it as too. And then here's the good one, because we talked about this last time Dan was here. Can I get it if I'm pregnant or breastfeeding? And
Ooh.
the answer is yes.
Yes, it is. Yeah, you can get it. There's that's also been, again, a concern about fertility and birth
Hmm.
defects and everything. Like, people are concerned about that, but there's absolutely no evidence that the vaccine, has caused any infertility. A lot of pregnant women have gotten it, and we're trying to get more information as a scientific community about it. But there's, like, this has been done with other vaccines in the past, where pregnant women, to try and prevent diseases that are particularly nasty to newborns, will
Hmm.
get vaccinated for other infectious diseases in their third trimester. And the reason is, when you get vaccinated and you build up your antibodies from in your immunity, mothers can pass antibodies from their bodies to their babies' bodies through breastfeeding. And
Right.
so when you have antibodies built up in the sera of your body, as a mother, that gets transferred to your milk, and that has antibodies in it. Milk gets into the baby. Baby now has some kind of, it's called passive immunity, which
Hmm.
is a
Mhm.
short-term kind of immune protection against diseases that would really, hurt a lot of, or cause a really severe disease in infants.
I love
So that's
that.
something. So that's something that has been done for other vaccines. There is more additional studies about that going on. I don't actually know the literature about COVID vaccination in third trimester pregnancy. I know that it is something that doctors are recommending because of these other vaccines that have been used. But that's something that we believe. And also, on the infertility question or concern. Um, the way that we know that the COVID vaccine does not cause infertility is, first of all, look in the epidemiology. We're not seeing, spontaneous abortions or other
Right.
issues at a higher rate. Like, it's people who pregnant women who get vaccinated versus pregnant women who don't get vaccinated. It's the rates are exactly the same of those, issues, miscarriages, spontaneous abortions, etc. But
Mhm.
also think of it from like let's logic this out. The way that the vaccine works, or at least the Pfizer Moderna vaccines, for example, the Pfizer Moderna vaccines are designed to give you, or to train your body to express a bunch of proteins that look like what's on the virus, right? And the virus those viral proteins trigger an immune response. So you have those immunity, your antibodies, your memory cells from your immune system that build up an immune memory against the virus through the vaccine. That is basically doing the whole immune response without actually getting the infection. If the vaccine was able to cause infertility, what we would be seeing is that pregnant women who got infected with COVID, where they said just another way for the same proteins of the virus to be entered into your body is by infection as opposed to vaccine, that process would cause a very large number of spontaneous abortions and miscarriages. And if you look at the pregnant women who have gotten COVID, we're not seeing that. So there was no, like, some people were concerned about it because of some vague sequence similarity in some sections of the two proteins to something else in the uterus, but we don't actually have the data for the actual infection to show that infection causes infertility. So that's another reason why we know it's not the case, because we see infection causing infertility and the vaccine causing infertility, and we don't see either of those.
That is good to hear. I'll say that 80,000 pregnant women are being monitored by the vSafe COVID-19 pregnancy registry. So if you're interested, if you're pregnant or thinking about, you can always look that up and then have some peace of mind there. Because
First,
there's people studying all this stuff, and if we're not going to be smart enough to learn it on our own, which we shouldn't have to, we should at least trust the people that we educated to be smart enough about this stuff, because they'll come to you about something eventually. You know what I mean?
exactly. And we've got a friend who is pregnant and just got their second shot, I believe, yesterday. So,
Woohoo!
like, it's I like that. I'm not envious of someone making that decision, because that's a whole nother level of considerations about
Right.
your health, the health of the fetus, and just what could happen. But the fact of the matter is that, like Dan said, there's just been no evidence that, fertility rates have changed, or miscarriages have changed due to vaccination or COVID.
Right. I think it's really great that people are studying that. But if you care about that, then follow those centers. You know what I mean? All right. So we have 6 minutes left in this episode. I'm going to ask Dan about something that really is important to me, and that is the effects of the vaccine on people with suppressed immune systems.
Ooh.
Oh, in terms of the vaccine causing problems for people with suppressed immune systems?
Should I, if I know that I have a suppressed immune system, should I go ahead and get the vaccine?
That, again, I'm going to punt that to talking to your health provider.
Yeah, right. Me
There,
too.
Right.
because I don't want to give broad spectrum guidance that might or might not apply to folks, but it's important to consider your medical history.
Right.
There are some people who are immune compromised, who have gotten the vaccine and had no issues, but there are some people who are very severely immune compromised who are not getting the vaccine because they're concerned about their immune system, and those are the people that we need to protect, just like we do with other vaccines, right? A lot of kids, think of kids with cancer who can't get vaccines because their immune systems are completely shot, and an immune dosage from a vaccine might cause some severe issues. Those are the people we're protecting from death by yellow fever, or death by, I don't know, think of dengue or whatever, or God knows what else we get vaccinated for these days. We're getting those vaccines, hepatitis A, for example. We're getting those vaccines to protect those who cannot. So if you are concerned about your immune system, if you've had a immune suppressing condition like HIV or cancer or Crohn's disease or some other immune disorder, definitely bring it up with your doctor, talk it over with them, and see what is best for you given your own individual history. But for those of us who do not have suppressed immune systems, think and keep in mind that when you're making a decision about whether or not to get vaccinated, that vaccination of people who are healthy is a really good way to protect those around us who are vulnerable because of their immune systems. And we're helping them live their lives to the best of their ability with a good vaccine in our arms.
Yes. People with autoimmune disease, conditions. You're not exempt from getting the vaccine, but like Dan said, you got to talk to your doctor about it, and you got to weigh the risks. And if you do get vaccinated, you still have to follow the guidelines of social distancing, sanitization, and masking, just for your health. Okay.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of those things that we tend to not think about all that much is that, the number of people we know that are immunocompromised, immunosuppressed is a lot greater. But one of the things that I think we also fail to really think about and really address is the number of people who really don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that's something that we really also need to take in consideration in terms of thought, because it's that you don't know what you don't know. When we look at our health system, the number of people who just have not been able to figure out what's wrong with them because they can't afford to get into the doctor. Like that's something that you really have to take into consideration.
Yeah, and that goes beyond your basic checkup that like an insurance will pay for,
Right.
And that
exactly.
also goes back to what we talked about at the beginning of the episode with like systematic racial issues and
Right.
socioeconomic status, right? The places where we're seeing the highest rate of mortality from COVID by like community are those that have overwhelming or underwhelming supplies of medical care, and people who just are not able to get to a doctor either because they're financially not able to have one, they don't have insurance, or just the doctor's offices are not in that area. So
Right.
it's not just an issue of like, when I say talk to your medical provider, I fully acknowledge that the tens of millions of Americans don't have that privilege. And that's all the more responsible for those of us who do have the ability to have medical care, to do the responsible thing, make the responsible choice to protect those who, for reasons outside of our own individual control, cannot get the medical care they need, so they don't know whether or not they're immune compromised.
That's right.
Absolutely.
I love that. You're just so special, Dan. We'll be right back. And we're back. I love that kind of stuff. So here's a great one, and one that might be a great conversation because it's fresh off the press. Can children get the COVID-19 vaccine?
Yes.
Okay. The answer here is not yet.
Yeah. The Pfizer I think the expectation is that this week the FDA is going to extend its emergency use authorization for the Pfizer vaccine for children ages 12 to 15, because they have been doing ongoing clinical trials. We'll see how that goes. I'm not sure about Moderna. I need to double check. I don't want to say
Moderna's said that they're looking to get their EUA towards the end of the month.
Okay, yeah, so it looks like it's going to happen as well. That's good.
Yeah,
Right.
they're so like what I was seeing, and this actually is a very interesting topic of discussion, because this is something that Debbie and I had spoken about, but this is something that I definitely want to bring you in on this one, Dan. So Pfizer's data shows that what they're reporting is 100% efficacy in children 12 through 15. Moderna's data, what they said is that it's 96% effective from ages 12 to 17, because the caveat there, Pfizer tested down to age 16 with their initial emergency use authorization. Moderna did to 18, so they didn't have the 17 and 16 range. That they lumped into this particular range. So the question, because mathematically speaking, nothing is 100% effective. So Dan, can you talk to us about why Pfizer might say that their vaccine is 100% effective, and what does that actually mean?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. That's the heart of vaccination, right? So,
Right.
First of all, when you're talking about there's efficacy and effectiveness. Efficacy is a measure of how well the vaccine did in a clinical trial under carefully designed and tested conditions. Effectiveness is the same set of calculations, except just done in like a larger general populace. So efficacy is what is calculated in order to get authorization or approval. Effectiveness is what is calculated after the vaccine's been distributed for a while. And it's kind of not jokingly, but euphemistically called like a phase 4 trial, like after the vaccine's been distributed. So the definition of, say, vaccine efficacy is comparing the rates at which a disease occurs after vaccination among those who are vaccinated versus those who are not vaccinated. So Pfizer can say 100% efficacious against COVID because that means that of the people who were vaccinated in that trial, 0 got the condition that they were looking for. Like, so in this case, it might have been symptomatic COVID, like you actually feel ill and test positive, right? If you have 0 people who got the vaccine and then over the course of the trial then got symptomatic COVID, then that is 100% effective, or 100% efficacious, excuse me, for the vaccine. But whenever you expand out from the efficacy of a clinical trial to the effectiveness of just the general population, inevitably you're going to see the effectiveness numbers drop a little bit compared to the efficacy numbers. So, for example, vaccine efficacy for the Pfizer vaccine in the first initial EUA was, I think, like 92 or 93%. Again, double check on me. But then a lot of the studies of the effectiveness in different populations have shown it to be like 85 to 90% effective, because when you increase your sample size, when you increase the number of people who are kind of measured in the experiment, you're going to have a higher likelihood of catching a couple of people who do still get COVID or do still have some kind of condition as well. So those numbers are going to drop. So a lot of it is a function of how large your group is. But you can say 100% efficacious, but you don't just say it's 100% effective. It's 100% efficacious in the group of participants that were studied for the purpose of this trial. Right. And so that's always important to think about. Again, epidemiology is the science of denominators. What is your denominator? How many people were in this trial? Of the people in this trial, 100% efficacious. Of the people in the world, a couple 100 million who probably will get the Pfizer vaccine by the end of this year, what is the effectiveness when you compare it among the couple 100 million people who did or did not get vaccinated? Very different denominators. You're going to expect some variability between those numbers. Does that answer your question, Jeffrey?
Yes, that is exactly what I was going to go with. Like for me, like as a data person, when I see that something is 100%, that immediately makes me question, what did their sample look like? Because and how did they structure their sample? Because nothing is ever 100% effective. So immediately to me, there are questions of, did they cherry pick potentially different things in order to make it more effective or efficacious, I should say? Versus, like with Moderna, they had 96% efficacy. So to me, that it looks a little bit more realistic in that, it's closer to what their numbers were. The initial numbers for Pfizer and Moderna were 95 and 94.1% efficacious. In the real world, looks like both of them dropped down to about 90%, at least when I was reading the Israeli study on Pfizer that it dropped down to 90%. The US healthcare providers, both for Pfizer and Moderna, that dropped down to 90%. And I'm sure that as we get more data, that's going to change even more. Because one of the other things we have to keep in mind is the fact that there are now variants that are out there that, while the vaccine does provide, still significant protection, those variants are still able to break through, and breakthrough cases is something that's coming up. So before we go on to breakthrough cases, though,
they weren't tested in the original trials. That's
exactly.
But that's there have been additional studies of vaccine effectiveness against some of these variants, and there was a study I think that just came out last week that showed that the Pfizer vaccine was very effective against the B.1.1.7 variant. So there's another thing to keep in mind is that when you talk about effective versus efficacious, like to Jeffrey's point, like what are you actually studying? There are 4 metrics that are being talked about for vaccine efficacy for COVID. The first is asymptomatic infection, as in, is the virus going to be able to get into your body and you test positive? Sorry, asymptomatic or any infection of any kind, right? Symptomatic or asymptomatic, right?
Okay.
If you test, what is your likelihood of testing positive if you got the vaccine relative to your odds of testing positive without getting the vaccine? That's the first one. The second one is symptomatic COVID, right? Some people test positive for COVID and don't have any symptoms. A lot of people do get symptoms. If you're only looking to see some people who check whether or not people who test positive and are sick, then that's like your effectiveness numbers are probably going to be higher because you're deliberately excluding people who tested positive and not feeling symptoms, right? So that's one way to go from you might be 90% effective against asymptomatic COVID, or asymptomatic or symptomatic COVID, but then you might be 95% effective against symptomatic COVID because you're excluding the positive tests with no symptoms. Then there's hospitalizations or severe COVID, and then there's deaths, right? So COVID infection of any kind, COVID with symptoms, severe COVID with hospitalization, or COVID resulting in death, right? Those are the 4 metrics that are being studied for every vaccine trial, right? So most of the time when people talk about vaccine efficacy or effectiveness, the number that they're throwing around is symptomatic COVID infection. And that's because the clinical trials for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were based on that, right? When they got the emergency authorization, it was not based on data of whether or not folks tested positive or not. It was whether or not they were sick and then tested positive. So that's something to keep in mind about, when you're talking about how data are presented, like Jeffrey is making a fantastic point about that. Those are the 4 metrics you should be looking at every study. And what we found, fortunately, is that these vaccines are very effective against people getting sick from COVID, but they're also very effective against people just testing positive at all. So, if that's, and being an asymptomatic carrier. So important to have that distinction and keep that in mind, that you're not just looking at COVID, no COVID, like how you define COVID is there are semantics in there.
But the very sick, the reoccurring, that was a happy thing to discover, that we might not actually be able to get the disease again. What I want to say is, it's kind of like efficacy is like Michael Jordan throwing free throws in practice, and hitting 100% of his free throws. And then the other one is more of the general public with all free throws. And what we're saying is nobody's dying from throwing a free throw, but they are missing from time to time.
Yeah.
Right.
Or Michael Jordan doing, or any basketball player
game.
shooting free throws in practice versus in a game, or
Right.
it's a really good analogy. It's like when you introduce other stuff that was not included in a carefully designed trial, there's going to be stuff that makes things less perfect, and that's okay. That's to be expected. What we don't want is efficacy to be 90% and effectiveness to be 20.
Right. We don't want Michael Jordan falling on the floor having a heart attack after he throws a free throw. And
exactly.
What we're saying is that hasn't happened yet. In fact, he didn't even have to go to the hospital. He never even got sick enough to stop throwing free throws.
Exactly.
So what do you think that if I've already had COVID, do you think I should get the vaccine now?
Yes, we're encouraging everyone to get the vaccine regardless of whether or not you've had COVID, and the reason is it's kind of a, how do I phrase this? We know how much COVID immunity, roughly speaking, is delivered into someone's body with the vaccine, right? They're very standardized dosages. We know the concentrations of the proteins, the spike proteins that are getting into people when you get the vaccine. And we know that on the whole, that level is a lot higher than a lot of people who get like a minor disease or minor symptomatic infection.
Right.
So when you have a stronger introduction of, antigen into your body, you have a stronger memory built against it. And we kind of know that that's really stable. A lot of people who have asymptomatic COVID or mildly symptomatic COVID might not get all that much virus into their body. And so because of that, there's not as much exposure to the immune system to build memory, and we don't really know how long that immunity can last. There is some evidence, like the CDC guidance is looking out 90 days, like we know there's some short-term immunity to reinfection of COVID with most of the time 90 days or more. Some data suggests that it could be up to 6 or 7 months, if not more. But again, that's also limited by the fact that COVID's not been around for that long. But we are confident that, COVID vaccination, because there's a lot more antigen introduced into the body than a lot of minor infections, most people are going to be more immune from getting the vaccine than whether or not they got COVID. And in fact, there are some data that have come out to suggest that, right? People who've gotten COVID without getting vaccinated versus people who've gotten COVID and gotten vaccinated 1 or 2 doses versus people who didn't get COVID and got vaccinated, right? And what we see is people who had COVID on the whole have lower levels of antibodies than people who got any vaccination of any kind on the whole. We have those data, those have been published. So we have the proof that works. And that's why you say like COVID plus vaccine is more protective than just getting the vaccine. That's another thing too. So if you want more immunity, get the vaccine, even if you've gotten COVID.
And I can speak to the mathematics of this too, because I was actually studying the math on this one. So when they looked at the study, and so there's a lovely set of box grams and histogram charts about what that immune system response looks like. So they actually broke it down quite nicely, so that way you could see what it looked like. So there was immunity to the immunity that people that had COVID would have later was actually pretty scattered all over the place. So it was it was up and down. It was there was a certain level of immunity to have that you would have, but it would be less predictable. Then there was the immunity that you had after you got 1 shot of one of the COVID vaccines. And so it was a bit more predictable how much immunity you would have, but it was still all over the place. Then you had COVID plus the one shot of one of the vaccines, and that actually got even tighter in terms of the response that they were seeing, but it was higher. So there was more there. What they were seeing is that there were more neutralizing antibodies and more markers there that would say that a person would have an expected response. But the highest yet was when you had 2 doses of the vaccine. That grouping became even tighter yet and even larger. So
Right.
with that, what we're saying, what we're seeing mathematically speaking is that between not getting the vaccine, getting COVID plus one shot, or getting 2 shots of the vaccine, the ability to predict your body's immunoresponse to it, mathematically speaking, is that when you get 2 shots, you're going to have a much more predictable immune response, in that you're going to have more antibodies, statistically speaking, and that response is going to be far more predictable than just leaving it to natural chance, or even just having had the virus and then getting the shot.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic description. The Jeffrey, you nailed it. I took the liberty of, I know we're recording by Zoom. I just dropped the link to the article that Jeffrey and I were referring to. It's in the chat.
Oh,
So,
nice.
Jason, if you wanted to share that with the followers, that's something that
Mm-hmm.
some of the text is kind of dense and really jargon filled, but you can really see there's a wonderful graph that shows exactly what Jeffrey's talking about, and folks who are or who don't have a really strong science background can really see the difference of, like, it's very well designed, it's a very simple and effective graph. So I think that's a really powerful message to show. So that
I
link is
like that.
for people to share.
Okay. I just want to say that, like, if everybody gets the vaccine in a 2 month span, we know when it starts to run out. But if half of us get the vaccine in the 2 month period, but others of us got the virus 6 months earlier, then we're our the length of immunity varies. And some people, it's harder to quash the virus when it has somewhere to go. But if we all get it at once, then there's nowhere for the virus to go for the amount of time that we're all immune at the same time. And I think that's a big deal. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, yeah.
So Dan, now
Yeah.
I got one for you. This one's going to be a fun
Yay.
one. So, one of the best pieces of news that I've seen here coming up is that, Moderna is already testing and tooling up one of their variant boosters. And they're showing that there is a statistically significant response in the immune system, and that it looks to be effective against the Brazil and South African variants. Moderna's testing that one out right now. When it comes to boosters, are we going to see similar trials based on, how we're seeing the COVID vaccine now? Or when it comes to boosters, do you have to go through that process all over again in order to get that approval, in order for a booster to be used?
Yes, my understanding, again, if folks have better information than this, they can always fact check me. But my understanding is, yes, for a booster shot, it's just the same as going through a whole additional series of trials, because you need to show that that booster shot is safe and effective, right? So if the booster shot does not actually substantially improve immunity, then it might not get it authorized or approved. So it's going to be important for Moderna and for Pfizer, who are doing something similar, to show that a booster shot is not only safe, but it actually is effective. Because if you start giving everyone booster shots and they really don't substantially improve people's immunity, then there's no point in having a mass campaign to get spending hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to get the vaccine distributed to folks. So it's going to be important for them to go through the same process, to show the data, to submit it to the FDA for their review, and to get either EUA or approval for this booster dose. But I'm optimistic to see that, and I really do want to see some of the raw data myself. That'd be exciting.
Yeah, it would.
This kind of stuff is actually exciting to me because, like, that's, I think, one of the biggest things that we've all been concerned about, at least in the scientific community, is that what does it take to get a booster tooled up with these new mRNA systems from Pfizer and Moderna? You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's because we've always had this issue of lagging behind new variants of a disease that come up. The ability for these companies to tool up new boosters is going to be very important, because as we're seeing in India right now, there is it is a
man.
huge problem. And if you think that this is only something that could happen to India, they only crossed our threshold for deaths for the first time. Like, we had it bad for a while, and India's
Right.
finally hit the death threshold that we have. But in terms of cases, I mean, it's astronomical.
And the lack of infrastructure is terrible. I like to think that India is what we would have been if Donald Trump had been reelected.
Yeah, well, my heart does. I don't want to say my heart goes out to India, but it really is a very difficult situation. And one thing that's been particularly alarming for me is to look at not just the case numbers, but the positivity rate, right? So
Right.
when you
Right.
do testing, what we've been monitoring for, and there's been a lot of policies, especially in Pennsylvania where I live, a lot of policies have been implemented based not only on number of cases, but on positivity rate, because the rate of tests that you're doing that are positive is a kind of a barometer, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
for the percentage of true COVID cases you're actually capturing. So we were trying to like have enough COVID testing so that, positive test rates are 5% or lower. The most recent numbers out of India and their most recent surge, with the cases going super, super high, they're above our threshold for COVID cases, and their positivity rate is over 20% and is rising. So it's not just that the numbers of cases are rising, it's that the percent of positive cases is going up, which means there are, for every case that we're identifying by testing, there are a bunch more that we're not. So the
Right.
true number, the true burden of COVID that's hitting India is a lot higher than what we're even measuring, and that's really concerning.
And they do
But
have
yeah,
four times the population size of us. Speaking
they
of
do.
denominators.
Yeah, they do, and it's also like because there's a lot of rural areas in India where that vital statistics like mortality and births and deaths are not very effectively calculated because of lack of
Right.
infrastructure. There are a lot of people dying that we're just not catching. So
Mm-hmm.
again, the death numbers are probably a lot higher because the positivity rate is that barometer for how severe the disease is and how much we're not catching.
Right.
So it is really concerning. And for frame of reference, the moving average positivity rate at least in my county in Pennsylvania, at the very peak of the pandemic, never really reached above, I think, 15 to 18%. In the darkest parts of the most brutal days of the winter when we were really, in the
Mm-hmm.
shit, and they're already skyrocketing past 20% in India, and it's only going up.
Wow.
So it's really, really significant. So yes, booster shots, additional development, but to the point about booster development, that's one of the beautiful things about the development of these mRNA vaccines, right? Developing a vaccine that is like a partial, like a live attenuated or a killed virus
Right.
is a lot harder to do than with this mRNA. Like you can synthesize mRNA pretty easily. It's a very well established thing to do. So you just need to
Mm-hmm.
get the sequence. You do the sequencing. And you're like, okay, this is the sequence. So in theory, a really good vaccine could be developed. A vaccine that is designed to boost immunity against a variant can be designed very quickly, matter of days can be designed. Then it's like the testing and clinical trials and everything. So we do have the capacity as a scientific community to develop immune boosters or booster vaccines for variants very quickly. It's just a question is, are there going to be consequences? Is the side effects going to be bad, or
Mm-hmm.
worries about immunity and everything, or worries about anaphylaxis or side effects and everything. So I'm
Sure.
optimistic that what the mRNA platform is very well designed to respond to variants. It's just a question of will it actually work in practice, because the theory is great.
Sure. But I mean, it's no more dangerous than a peanut to some people at this point. It might hurt some people, it might not hurt some other people. That doesn't mean we all should not eat a peanut.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things about, like, in speaking to Dan's point, this is technology that was pretty much theoretical about 18 months ago. So
Mm-hmm.
the fact of the matter is that, we had a pretty good idea that we could do this, but we just weren't quite there yet.
Right.
And so, like, our understanding of what all, our understanding of what all the potential side effects were going to be were very limited at the time. And now that we've had tests done, and then we've had a broader use by the population. And, really this stuff has only been available to the public for about 6 months now. And in the beginning, very limited availability to the public. It's only now that we're starting to see broader availability. So from a data perspective, it's only going to be in the next few months that we're going to have a much broader understanding data-wise what we're even looking at, and
Yeah.
that is going to go into the consideration of what could happen with the booster shots. That's two of the biggest enemies that we have in terms of math are time and data,
Mm.
because you have to have both. And the reality is that if you haven't had something out for a very long period of time, the reality is that you're not going to have a lot of data. You could have something out for a long period of time and have little data because of lack of adoption. But
Right.
in like these beginning stages where it's more about the availability, like we had very limited availability, but now as we're getting broader availability, now time is our enemy and our friend.
Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, you don't know what data sets are important and what aren't. Are either one of you confident in the data that was collected over the first year of this?
Absolutely. I mean, this is
Yeah.
Yes.
one of the biggest data science projects in the history of civilization.
Okay.
I mean, we had the whole concept of having a live updating system where people log their side effects of the vaccine into a national database that can be
Right.
mined very quickly, and in the matter of like less than 10 days for scientists to be able to review that, notice an alarming trend with the Johnson & Johnson with this really severe blood clotting disease, and be
Mm-hmm.
able to pause that. The fact that that was able to happen is an
Yes.
absolute marvel of modern science and an absolute marvel of the collaboration that's gone into it. So I'm very
Yeah.
confident in it. And that's the thing, like we have more data about this vaccine than any vaccine developed in history, or these vaccine
Yep.
platforms.
Okay.
So I'm very optimistic to see the future of this. And it has been really wonderful to see a lot of communities come together to make this happen. I know we're concerned about vaccine hesitancy. I know there's concerns about variants, but we have definitely proven to the universe that we can respond to global crises very effectively if we put our minds to it. So I'm very optimistic. What do you think, Jeffrey?
From a data standpoint, I absolutely am confident in the data. I think, once again, our going back to our biggest enemy was time and data availability. Like even if we don't talk about the COVID vaccine in general, but even just data surrounding COVID itself, you don't like there's probably a bunch of data out there that we don't have simply because we didn't know what we were looking for in the beginning.
Right.
And that's one of those that's unfortunately just the curse of any type of scientific revelation is that if you don't know that you should be looking for something, you're not looking for it until suddenly something is just blaring in your face and it's like, okay, I need to look
Mm-hmm.
at this, I need to study this. And then from there it's about having the availability to be able to study and test it. When you look at just how we were able to test for and identify COVID, even in the early days of the virus itself, testing was very limited and it wasn't very effective. Now, the effectiveness of testing for the virus is a little bit better than it was, probably not as great as we would like it to be, but the data that we're getting is now is far better than what it was in the beginning. And then from there, now being able to collect, log, and analyze data, like to Dan's point, where now we're able to look and see, what that spread looks like, what that positivity rate looks like. It is allowing us to, instead of using a sledgehammer on a
Mm-hmm.
finishing nail, now we can use just a little, just the right sized hammer to get this done, as long as we have community participation. In terms of the data that we're getting from the vaccine itself, this is one of those things where there's always going to be issues with self-reported data,
Mm-hmm.
and this is where it gets tough with COVID, and people reporting symptoms and going and getting tested. You have a discrepancy between people who, once they figure out that they have COVID, then there's the question of, well, why should I go and get tested? All of these symptoms match up. I probably have COVID. What's the point in getting tested? Well, the point in getting tested for COVID is to positively identify the case, so that way you can notify others of
Mm-hmm.
what might be happening. And that allows you to stop community spread. So when it comes to being able to mathematically look at it, the more data that you have, the better you are at initiating policies that protect public health. It
Right.
allows you to be able to address things within your community before it becomes a statewide problem or a national problem. Same holds true with the vaccine.
Mm.
Like with Johnson and Johnson, you've got a lot of people that are entering information. Now, the issue there is that, once again, self-reporting always has its issues. What do I notice that is different since I've gotten the vaccine versus what do I notice that, what do I want to report?
Right.
For example, when you do a bunch of stupid stuff, you hurt all of the time. So the question becomes is, does the pain that I'm feeling today, is that more because of the vaccine that I took, or is it just the weather's changing and my shoulder's fucking shot? Because that's a reality for me too.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, without really when it comes to the individual and not being monitored by a medical professional, there's only so much data that is going to be good. Now, for example, like where I had difficulty breathing, that clearly, from what I could tell, it felt like what it was like when I was sick. And I did not have any problems like that in the many months leading up to when I got that shot. Even after I got the first shot, I did not have those issues. So when I got that second shot, I made sure to note that, because that's something that happened to me that, number one, I felt when I was sick, but hadn't felt in the year plus since I'd been sick, and didn't feel after the first dose of the vaccine. Self-reporting is always going to have some problems, but when you have medical professionals that get involved, that's when you start to get a little bit more objective data rather than subjective data. And so that's one of those things that we're always going to be up against, because subjectively, I always hurt, and depending on my mindset, yeah, it's the vaccine. No, it's not the vaccine. But if I'm in the hospital with a side effect, the doctor is going to be like, yeah, that kind of looks like it's most likely an effect from the vaccine itself.
Right. Because you're on a website trying to come up with something, right? And that's different than somebody saying that's a something. And just really quickly, if you are diagnosed with COVID-19, you can get the vaccine, you can get the first dose. You have to finish your isolation period of 10 days and then have 24 hours of lack of symptoms before you get your second dose. But that was basically
we
all
don't
the
want
questions.
anybody with symptoms or with who have COVID to go get the vaccine. So just make sure that if you do test positive, you're out of isolation, but there's no requirement, as Jason was saying, there's no requirement that you have to wait after your COVID recovery. Just recover and get out of isolation first. And that's mainly
Right.
to protect, well, first of all, we don't want people getting a bunch of antigen when they're trying to recover from a disease. That's also a way to protect the healthcare providers and other people going to the vaccine clinic, right? Don't go with
Right.
COVID because you might expose and get others sick.
Beautiful. So that's all the real questions I had. I have a personal question, and that is, I have macular degeneration, which is a form of an immune disease. My immune system attacked my eyes, causing swelling. I got the vaccine and I had no symptoms. Do you think I should be reporting that somewhere?
You should. I would strongly encourage anybody who gets the vaccine to be actively reporting how
Okay.
they're feeling and everything to VSafe, or to the system that you can get when you register or when you get a vaccine. Sign up for that. And if you say you're feeling good, all the more reason for
Yeah,
us to know if you're feeling good. You should log it still.
I love that.
To Jeffrey's credit, is like, if you know what's going on, still log it, because then we can get the right denominators, right? If
Yeah.
a bunch of people if the people who are reporting issues are over, like, biased towards people who are only reporting those issues, and the
Right.
people who are saying I'm fine, so I'm not going to bother, that's going to make it look like situations are much more severe than they actually are. So be part of the experiment. Log the fact that you're doing well. Log the fact that you're feeling fine, so that we have accurate data to be able to make correct assessments for the public.
That's beautiful. I want that.
That was the beautiful thing about like that VSafe program is that
Mm-hmm.
it gave me the opportunity to log what I was feeling and how it was affecting me. So that way, when this data gets analyzed later by the FDA, they're going to be able to sit down and say, okay, people who got the vaccine, yeah, it looks like pretty commonly getting some sight pain. That was
Right.
definitely a thing. Okay, we can say that that's the thing, but now we can look at what that pain threshold looked like. Mild, okay. Yeah, that, I mean, anybody who's ever gotten a tetanus shot knows that getting a shot in the arm sucks.
Yeah.
But if when it starts to be like, okay, now it's affecting me and how I am in the day, it gives doctors, well, later, who are going to be giving out these shots, a little bit more information to say, hey, you know, if you have a certain set of markers, you might run into some issues where you might want to plan for a day off to give yourself some time to recover
Yeah.
if you can, or plan to get a shot on a day when you know you're going to have a day off, because that's one of the things that we're going to have to keep in mind is not everybody gets a paid day off in order to be able to recover from anything.
Yeah.
That's just the reality of it. So being able to get the best information you can and pass it off to those who need it is going to be really important.
Yeah.
But then even too, things that aren't listed in the VSafe, like for example, difficulty breathing is not a checkbox that was on the
Hmm.
Moderna vaccine.
Right.
Now, granted, I didn't feel like I was in any sort of danger when I was having difficulty breathing. It's something that is important to log because there are going to be other people out there that have that symptom.
Right.
And doctors and doctors and scientists need to be able to figure out what does that percentage look like,
Yeah.
especially whether or not people may or may not have had COVID. So for me, where I had difficulty breathing, there's a lot of factors to consider. Number one, I'm pretty sure I had it, as I said before. I'm pretty sure I had COVID before we knew what COVID was. But number two, I'm also an asthmatic. So it could be that I had COVID. I got that after I got that second shot. I got the breathing issues. Bam,
Yeah.
breathing issues. But there could also be a bunch of people, more people out there. It's like, I never got COVID. I'm an asthmatic. I got breathing issues. So then doctors are going to be able to sit down and say, okay, if you're an asthmatic, there is an X percent chance that you might develop difficulty breathing.
Right.
Here's what our recommended path is. Here's what you need to be looking out for. And of course, if you feel like your life is in danger, call 911.
Right. Right. I wonder how many people are underreporting or over-reporting that giant penis syndrome. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm here to report that
it's
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 massive.
Yeah.
ha. I think it's hilarious to see. What nice pun there. I think it's hilarious to see some people like they're reporting all these kinds of fun things. Like, yeah, there's always going to be some people who mess with the data and everything, but
Right.
that's also really valuable for us to know because the percentage of people who actively like throw things in there is also a rough percentage of data that you can discount. And there's actually
Mm-hmm.
a really famous data experiment that was done on soldiers in Vietnam. About trying to see what percentage of them were smoking marijuana that grows widely in the jungles of Vietnam, and the design was deliberately inclusive of a bunch of questions that they would just answer as yes naturally, so
Uh-huh.
that when they like and you'd be able to discount the like bogus answers from it. So I think so it was like you had 100 cards. 50 of them had some questions like, is the sky blue, or do you like do you like candy, or something like that, where you would definitely answer yes. So that, and you wouldn't it was blinded so that people didn't know what your
Mm-hmm.
question was. You just pick a card and answer yes or no. And so 50% of them would just say yes. Well, you discount 50% of the answers, which were yes, and then you get a true nature of the rest. So I think there's something also is like when you have these bogus answers that people are putting into the VSafe system, that is a proportion that you can actually just subtract, because it's like, okay, well, 0.3% of the data is bogus because people are actively putting stuff in. So let's get rid of that, and that actually corrects for a lot of our data. So
Right.
I think it's kind of a cool thing to see, is that you can actually quantify the dumbass stuff as well as the smart stuff.
But I
And
will
then
say,
that's funny too.
as a non-scientist, I will endorse the policy that the vaccine increases the size of your penis, but getting COVID shrinks it immensely. And so you want to consider that but I'm not saying Dan is saying that. I'm saying Jason is saying that.
Here's the funny
I
thing.
am not
Here's the
endorsing
funny thing.
I do not endorse that statement.
No, Dan did
But
not
but
endorse that
here's
statement.
but here's a funny thing is that what they have discovered is that people who've gotten COVID are actually there's actually a significant population that is getting erectile dysfunction after having COVID, because guess what? If you're not getting good oxygen flow,
Mm,
you're going to have a hard time getting it up.
I love
Reason I
it.
know this is because, funny enough, uh, so I have sleep apnea and I developed some significant problems with being able to get it up.
Mm,
Well, when you have a low blood oxygen count and your body's struggling to survive, turns out getting it up isn't a priority for your body.
That's right.
So, if you have COVID related issues that turn into messing with your lungs, you're going to end up with issues being able to get it up. So, that's actually something that has come up in the data, interestingly
Interesting.
enough.
I
So,
love it.
get your vaccine and make sure your pee still works.
I will endorse that statement.
I love that. So one of the best things, I don't know if you can answer or attest to this, or just you have friends that can. One of the best things about this vaccine to me was there was a point when I learned that there was 110,000 hospital beds in the country, and they were all full, plus some. And now I'm seeing that about 40,000 of those beds are full. And I think that is so amazing as a de-stressor to our hospital workers. And I don't know, Dan, if you know anybody that's on the front line in that way. Are they feeling it? Are they feeling the de-stress?
Well, I'm not necessarily on the front line, but my work is definitely in public health response. And I have
Yeah.
had the privilege of working with a lot of long-term care facilities that were absolutely wrecked by COVID, not just in the spring, but especially in the winter in like November,
Mm-hmm.
late November and into December. And nursing homes, skilled nursing facilities, and personal care homes were some of the first to get like mass vaccination out to the
Right.
elderly residents, because they were the highest rate of death and by major outbreak were in those facilities. And it was just night and day. Like the what we're seeing right now is facilities where there's high vaccine rates. There are still people getting COVID because they're not vaccinated. Most people who are getting COVID are not vaccinated, but you
Right.
have one case that turns into maybe two cases that goes back down to zero over a couple weeks, as opposed to 1 to 2 to 4 to 15 to 60. And
Right.
so I don't think I can speak personally to the hospital side. The hospitalization rates are substantially down, but
Mm-hmm.
it was really interesting to see not just overall like hospitalizations going down, but comparing anecdotally, admittedly, long-term care facilities with very good vaccination rates versus those that did not, the sizes of the outbreaks that they're still getting, the rates of hospitalizations and deaths that they're getting. It really is showing, I'm seeing firsthand the vaccine, well, not firsthand, secondhand. I'm seeing
Mm-hmm.
secondhand through these folks who work there. The vaccine is really doing its job very well. And yes, there are still some people who get sick, but the rate of hospitalization and rate of death is so low that we actually have the privilege of studying like individual deaths of
Yeah.
people who died with the vaccine and then died from COVID, which is very, very rare. And so you can actually be like, okay, what actually happened? And these government officials are going through death records because we have the privilege of doing that, as opposed to just being like, oh, another 50 deaths today. you know
Right.
so it's a huge, the vaccine has been a huge change of pace for our focus, because it has given us the privilege of being able to get off the like try to stop from drowning, and now we can like navigate the waters of like, okay, what are these data telling us overall? So
Yeah.
that's my personal assessment.
I just love that it's taking that stress off of our frontline workers that way. I hope they're getting some sleep.
Yeah,
Yeah, a lot of
no.
them are still frustrated by the being vaccinated, and still having to wear the mask and still having to do all the lockdowns and
Yeah,
all
that's
the
kind
extra
of
stuff. Like it is stressful, but it's a different type of stress than like having 15 people on a ventilator and 3 staff members because the rest of the floor got COVID. Like it's a different ball
Mhm.
game, a different series of discussions having to happen.
How do you
Mhm.
feel about still having to follow the protocols even though you've been vaccinated?
Um, I think obviously it's a good idea, especially in like healthcare settings where, that's masking and distancing and disinfecting is not just for COVID. It's standard infection prevention precautions
Mhm.
in healthcare settings, right? So, I see no issue with the idea of people still being trying to be really safe. And the overwhelmingly, when people do get COVID, and when COVID does spread in a facility, it's because of lapses in masking, distancing, disinfecting, and the standard stuff, right? It's
Right.
not a, it's the COVID outbreaks are not a surprise anymore. We know what causes them in these facilities and in these settings. It's lapses in infection prevention, and just because you've been vaccinated, it substantially decreases the chance of you being able to spread COVID, but it doesn't guarantee that you cannot. And so
Right.
when people start acting like it's a guarantee, that's when other lapses happen, and that's when things get risky. So from a public health perspective, I have no issue with it. I think it's just, the fatigue of having to do the masking, distancing, weekly testing, all this other stuff. It's the
Right.
fatigue is real, and I get it. It's hard.
But
And
they were doing all that anyway. They were in the hospital form. They were doing that anyway. But I'm talking about movie theaters or baseball games or
oh yeah,
you know,
yeah.
like at what point do we just have to I'm trying to figure out, do we exclude people that don't want to get vaccinated? Do we show our vaccine card? Am I safe in a
Oof.
theater without a mask at some point because I'm vaccinated, knowing that somebody in the theater might not be vaccinated? These are the things people are really concerned about, and I don't know how we
So
get.
here's my hot take on this. The
Ooh,
vaccine, especially the mRNA vaccines, we know that they protect you against COVID. Individually, they substantially reduce your risk of COVID.
right.
I think it's a strategic move, and this is going to be taken by some folks being like, it's a conspiracy. Like, I think it's a strategic move by public health officials to say, let's keep the masks on, even though you're vaccinated, and slowly roll back some of these protocols over time as
Mm-hmm.
more and more people get vaccinated. So, for example, if we came out and said, once the vaccine was available, hey, once you get the vaccine, you don't have to wear a mask or distance anymore,
Right.
everyone would say, hey, I have the vaccine, and no one would get vaccinated because there'd be no point.
Right. I
So
see
is it
that.
like, oh, it's all about control? Well, kind of, yeah. But that's a good thing, because if we just said, okay, screw it, you don't have to do anything anymore, and just make it really easy for you to lie about having a vaccine card, then you're
Mm-hmm.
not actually fulfilling the outcome. So the output is like number of vaccines. The output is the number of people who have to wear masks. The outcome is stopping people from getting COVID, right? And you have
Okay.
to think about the long term. If you have to enact policies that will prevent the spread of disease, and it's not just like, just having the science. Like, there's the science of the science, and then there's the science of the policy, and they're not always
Right.
the same thing. And it's challenging to be able to navigate both the policy and the scientific, like, worlds when it comes to it. So
Yeah.
I think it's a good strategy for people to still, have to wear masks when vaccinated, in indoor spaces. I still think it's a good idea for people to continue doing social distancing, not just for COVID, but it's actually preventing a lot of other diseases. But I
Totally.
see that it's not as simple as like, hey, we're vaccinated now, so we can just go back to normal. It's like, no, we should embrace some of these changes and be more mindful about our health,
Okay.
because of the pandemic, and prevent more disease.
Yeah.
Okay.
And mathematically speaking, I mean, we're not at that point where we've had enough vaccine taken in order
Yeah.
to really tamp down spread as it is.
Not
And
even
one of the
close.
other things that we're still even looking at too is how asymptomatic people may spread the disease. I know that there's been more information on that, but it's still one of those things where it's like most of our response for the last, year has been just like lock it down as hard as we can so that way we can try and get the hospital some breathing room until we get a vaccine.
Right.
And even still, one of the other issues and concerns that we have out there is variants and breakthrough cases because, like we talked about, nothing is 100% effective. So the question is what do we have to do to get as close to that number as we can? And I think one of the factors that even those of us who are vaccinated now have to take into effect is, when variants come through, the effectiveness of the vaccine does drop. Does
Mm-hmm.
it drop to a point that leaves us in danger? The answer right now seems to be not really, but from a public health perspective and a mathematics perspective, at least, we still want to get that number as low as possible.
Oh yeah.
So when you have Pfizer and Moderna working on boosters for variants that are currently the majority, and we can get those boosters into arms as well, so
Mm-hmm.
that way we can stop the spread, and then it becomes a mathematical model of predicting what the next main variant is going to be, so that way we can tool up a response to that.
Or local. If there's a variant that's hot in Montana, you can create something for Montana as opposed to Illinois, who has a different variant.
And that's going to be a little bit tougher unless you have a lot of facilities that are tooling up variants, and that's just not a thing, unfortunately.
Right.
But you do see cases take over mathematically a country, places where there's more freedom of travel in between. So like here in the United States, we had the South African and the UK variant, and I
Yeah.
think it was, Dan, you can correct me if it was the UK variant, I think is the one that became the dominant variant in the United States.
You're correct.
So it, being able to tool up a response to those variants, and the South African variants, the ones that we see as problematic, like the
Yeah.
ones that are clearly evading the protections of the vaccine, are we going to see things get closer to normal? Absolutely. Should it be a slow rollback? Public health, I think, is going to have a better understanding of what that rollback looks like,
And common sense.
especially as we get boosters produced and in arms. Do I think we're going to get closer to normal as the end of the year comes? Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it all just depends on, number one, people's willingness to participate in the vaccination effort.
Of course.
Number two, how quickly we can get boosters out for the variants, so that way we have even fewer breakthrough cases, especially like where Moderna is seeing an even greater production of antibodies with their boosters. So that's going to be exciting to see, because if these are more effective and produce greater responses, that means that we're going to see even fewer breakthrough cases, and we can really limit this down as much as possible and start to address whatever else might come through, if at all, if we even need to at all. And the answer is yes, we probably will, but it's not going to look like how it has, mathematically speaking.
I have a booster question for Dan. Can we put multiple protections for multiple variants into one vaccine, like the flu shot we get?
In theory, yeah.
Okay.
In practice, we don't really know how that would
we
work.
don't know yet.
Because we obviously hasn't been tried before. But if you're just looking at a purely theoretical situation, yeah, it could be. The challenge, though, it would be in vaccine production is like trying to make sure that you have a good mix. Like you're trying to make basically these emulsions. Talked about really early on the show about like the lipids versus the mRNA and everything. You need to be able to show that you could effectively package multiple mRNAs for multiple variants into the different lipid like packages,
right.
at a uniform enough like proportion so that like everyone's getting the right dosage. And that's a challenge, right? We'd have to see what happens, and I'm sure science would be able to figure out a way to do that, but it isn't possible in theory. But in practice, we don't really know how that would work, and we don't have any evidence. But that's something that we have
Moderna's actually testing that. Moderna's actually testing that with their booster, because they're using the Brazil and the South African variant in their booster. And I believe it's like the sequence that they're trying to work on. And I think this is in both. It's the E484K, I believe it is, of specific sequence that they're working on targeting that is present in both the Brazil and South African variants.
Nice.
Yeah, I could definitely see it working in theory. It's just like how well will it do in practice? Because everything's perfect on a whiteboard. When it goes into someone's arms is a very different thing. That's the whole reason why pharma is such a challenging industry to be in. Like you can come up with amazing ideas, and the rate of failure is so high. So
right. Dan, you know what's really scaring me about all this? Measles and whooping cough is on the rise. I think we're ignoring some other things that are going on.
Yeah, I mean, there has been. We definitely need to think more than just about COVID, but that's one of the encouraging things about the mRNA platform of vaccines being developed. Right, we can hopefully modernize and improve on vaccines that have been pretty much licensed for 50, 60, sometimes even more than 100 years. The same vaccine, right, or very similar vaccine. So there's ways that we can maybe update this, but also being mindful that in a one health approach, as we say, like there's lots of different things that we need to be mindful of, and that's one of the really good things about masking, distancing, and washing our hands, right? Hand hygiene is the fundamental idea of infection prevention, right? If we are continuing to sanitize our hands and wash our hands and continue to distance, like other diseases besides COVID are going to continue to be low. And that's actually something we've seen, is that a lot of other respiratory infections have been, like, we didn't have a flu season. We did not have a flu season because flu is less transmissible than COVID, and whatever worked on COVID worked exceptionally way better on flu. So And it wasn't from lack of testing, because we were testing, maybe not as much as we were, but like the rate of decline in flu testing relative to the rate of decline of positivity, like it
Hmm.
was definitely like flu was way down. So it's something for us to keep in mind, is that these practices in general are not just good things for COVID. It's good for, disease prevention
Everything.
in general. Yeah. So
Right. And then if I get the COVID vaccine and I need to go get my shingles vaccine, is there a time period I should wait? Should I talk to my doctor about that? Is it just okay to do? I don't.
yes. So the current guidance, at least in Pennsylvania, I don't know about federally, but it's probably the same, is that you should not, if you get any immunization besides the COVID vaccine, you should wait 14 days before getting your COVID shot. So
That's
if you
beautiful.
get dose one, you should wait 14 days on either side. So make sure that you're planning that out with your doctor, and actually, like when you go get your vaccines for COVID, they ask, like, have you gotten any immunization in the last 14 days? And if the answer is yes, they will turn you away. And that's not
Nice.
necessarily because it's been proven with causality that these
Hmm.
co-immunizations are severe. It's just we want to be on the extra safe side.
Yeah,
So
and let's keep our data clean.
absolutely, yep, exactly.
Nice. Hey, Dan, why don't you, do you have any, what was the last movie you watched? I like to end this with movie recommendations for some reason.
Oh, what was the last movie I watched? That's a good question.
Yeah.
Hang on, my wife is right here. I'll have to ask her.
I
Hey,
bet
what was the
you,
last movie I watched?
was it Outbreak?
Oh, it was no. It was we watched the Hobbit trilogy a few weeks ago. I just
Aw.
been oh, it's we were my wife did not really get into the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, so she's been very patiently like going along with me. So that's been the last just trying to show her we reading the books together, and like being able to, like, it's a nice evening activity just to pull out the books and just
Mm-hmm.
read through and talk about it, and then it's like, okay, well, we finished this book, let's watch the movie.
I love
So
that.
that's what I've been doing, but it's been far too long since I've actually sat down and watched a movie, because it's been a little busy in the world of public health.
And it's not going to get by me. Congratulations on the wedding.
Oh, thank you, yeah.
You're welcome.
And congratulations on defending your thesis too.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm now Master of Science.
Oh,
But yeah,
wow.
Welcome to the fold, Dan.
yeah, I'm happy
From
to
one
be here.
master
Yeah.
of science to another.
Oh yes,
Oh,
we're
yeah.
Master of Science, but that does not make us better than anyone. We
No.
have a responsibility to share good science with everyone now.
In fact, one of the funniest things that we always said, that our teachers always said to us, and that I have continued to, teach my kids is that Master of Science doesn't mean that I'm smarter than anybody else. Usually it just means I know how to use Google better than most people.
Amen to that. That's literally my life. I Googled my way. That's fantastic, right? Google is an amazing resource. It's like a lot of, it's not using Google really efficiently is a key skill, and you can learn it really well, but it can also lead you down some really bad paths into the misinformation. So that's an important thing we should be teaching our kids, is like how to use search engines really effectively, and how to fact check themselves and fact check sources.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We did that in episodes called Misunderstanding Misinformation, where we talked about links that you should be looking at, sources, and all of that stuff. So people should check that out. How about you, Jeffrey? Any movie?
What was the last movie that I sat down and watched? I think the last movie I sat down and watched was Jurassic Park.
Oh, that's right. You said that last week. You don't count.
Yeah, I know. Because I haven't had a chance to sit down and watch any movies. I've actually just been watching anime with the kids.
I
So,
love that.
because I'm a nerd, I love anime, and I'm really enjoying My Hero Academia with the kids. It's a good show.
Yeah, the new season just started, right?
Yes, it did.
All right. I just watched The Prophecy with Christopher Walken and Eric Stoltz. I couldn't go to sleep. Like, I put it on so I could go to sleep, and I watched it all the way through. And then I found out there's like 4 more. So
Christopher Walken's always a win.
yeah, always a
Absolutely.
win. Did you want to say anything in wrapping up, Dan? Did we miss anything? Should we have covered something else?
Oh no, we covered so much. It's been amazing to chat with you guys about all this really interesting stuff, and I'm just very happy to be able to come on and contribute to your guys' show. And I just want to tell everyone who's listening to, keep on keeping on. Get the vaccine if you can. Continue masking, washing your hands, social distancing, being a responsible public health citizen.
For sure.
We talked a lot about so much, but that's really the same thing as always being mindful and being respectful of the fact that we are still in a pandemic, and that we do have these unforeseen challenges, and we are not done with this just because the vaccine is out. So continue being responsible, continue showing respect for
Yeah.
your fellow Americans or wherever you are in the world, and be that responsible public health citizen. So that's
I
all I have
love
to
it.
say. What
If
about
you're
you,
not,
Jeffrey?
You know, you definitely hit the nail on the head. Is that, you know, I know that this is tough and trying and frustrating. I'm one of those people that I'm ready to be done with the damn mask as much as anybody else is. But
Mhm.
the reality is that, you know, we're not out of the woods yet. And, you know, if there is any question about why that is, I say look at what's happening in India, because there's always the chance that that could be us again.
Yeah.
And, you know, be a good you know, public health citizen to your friends, to your community, to your state, to your nation, to the world. You know,
Mhm.
we are going to get there. It's going to take a little time, and right now, you know, like as it has been, time has been our enemy. The more shots we get in arms and the more that we can get out to the rest of the world, the sooner that we do get to go back to doing the things without the mask, the sooner that those quote unquote liberties that some have felt that have been sacrificed are going to be returned to us. And
Mhm.
it's, you know, it's one of those things where the data is showing that what we're doing is working, especially as we get vaccines in arms. So
Yeah.
now it's let's keep this going. Let's get more vaccines in arms. Let's get boosters in arms. Let's get back to doing things that we love, like, you know, bratwurst at the ballpark during a summer game.
Right.
We can get there, and we're getting there. You know, hold on, have faith. We'll do this.
Yeah, and use your common sense. If my governor says that you don't have to wear a mask, I say I'm going to wear a mask anyway in the grocery store. But I also am looking for other people that are fully vaccinated, so I don't have to sit at a party with my mask on. But if one person isn't vaccinated, I'm putting my mask on because I believe that I shouldn't take my mask off till everybody can take their mask off.
And also too, just, you know, just to make sure that it's clear, you know, at this point, like, especially if you've been vaccinated, it's not about the worry of getting the vaccine in. The
Right,
mask has never been about protecting it from coming into you.
right,
It's about protecting other people who aren't vaccinated from you spreading it to them.
right.
That is still very much the case. So more vaccines in arms means less need for a mask.
That's
And
right.
it's for those who can't be vaccinated. And once we do hit that 70% threshold, I think we're going to see this get a lot better.
Yeah.
I'm very
Until
hopeful for that too.
until the next one comes around.
Hopefully it won't be for a while, but hopefully we will have a lot of data that says
Man.
that tells us what we
Yeah.
did, what worked, and what didn't.
Right
And when
now,
it comes
so
back around, I'll be happy to join back on the podcast to talk about it.
yay. I'm just
Yeah.
thinking that right now, somewhere in the world, there's a little baby virus just saying, it's my turn. And we need to be careful about all that. We can't think that this is the end all and be all for the next
No.
100 years.
Mm-hmm.
I
Agreed.
love you guys. Thanks for being here.
Too.
Thanks. Take care, everyone.
Bye.